Hi, this is the Ignoramus Guide podcast, and I am Wei Chan, and this is my co-host, Ileana
Hi,
Chan.
I'm Rihanna
And
Jen.
here's our special guest, model, actor, dancer, um,
None of
artist,
those things.
academic, Yann. Welcome.
Hello.
Yay.
Thank
Hey.
you. Thanks for having me.
And we're going to
Nice
be
to finally.
discussing. Oh, nice to finally be on this podcast.
But yes, yeah. After being an avid listener for the last while, so it's good. I feel very honoured to be on this side.
Oh, you're the listener. Yay.
Yeah.
We found the listener. So this month, book of the month is Debt, and that's what we'll be discussing.
Great.
Yay, it's a really, really big book.
Wait, this is a podcast, so you have to actually say what it is.
Oh, yes. Sorry. This is Debt, the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber.
Wait.
Yay. So why did we choose this book, Wei?
We chose it because, well, first of all, he died last year, which is sad. And I really, well, actually, I had read his book, Bullshit Jobs, during a very difficult time in my life. And I just really, really liked his tone. It was just the perfect mix of like snarky, but analytical. And it's just really, I think it resonates with a lot of people. So yeah, in fact, the book, Bullshit Jobs, came after a really famous article that he wrote, also called Bullshit Jobs, which everyone should go read. And I think a lot of people know it. It's pretty viral, but yeah, that's how I got onto him. And fortunately, he died last year. But Debt, the last 5,000 years, that is pretty topical in my mind. Not least because I've been watching Squid Game.
Oh, yes.
Are you watching that?
Squid Game.
Are you watching that?
I mean, obviously I've heard of it. I haven't started it yet.
What?
I know. I like to like let the hype sort of just peter out and people start complaining about how shit it is, and then I go in with like tempered expectations.
You either want to be
like...
before it's cool or after it's cool.
Well, yeah. I mean, the truth is I just haven't gotten around to it. What about you, Yann? Have you watched Squid Game?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I just finished the last episode. Since
No
I've been
spoilers.
No, I won't say anything. since I've been reading this book, I've been seeing debt everywhere. So I text Wei the other day. I was like, "Oh, Squid Game is all about debt."
Yeah,
the more
there are so many levels.
The more I think about it, everything. Yeah.
Yeah. So how familiar are you with David Graeber's work before this book? How were you?
And me, not very much. I've heard of his ideas about bullshit jobs, and I knew that he was involved in some way with the Occupy Wall Street movement. But this is the first sort of proper work of his I've read.
And this is like the 10-year anniversary, of Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah, so I think we're kind of talking about these things at a very interesting time, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that in a bit more detail as well as the book itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are your thoughts, both of you, about this book?
Wow.
Well, I guess in one way it's quite an unusual book, because it's really sprawling. So even though it's about debt, it kind of covers like the whole sort of range of like human history. He talks about I don't know, culture, like economics, history, all these things, and it's sort of giving this kind of really sort of long range sort of bird's eye view of the topic, and he's able to kind of, I guess, like trace the idea of debt through this whole range of things. It's really incredible, just the range of knowledge he has about such a variety of subjects. Like he's able to talk about anthropology,
through
ancient
death.
Greece.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
pretty
like every
amazing.
single aspect of life is to do with death. That's what I came away with. Like marriage,
Yeah.
dowries, laborers, like religion, military action, like everything is to do with death.
Morality,
Yeah.
crime, punishment, all of that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that was interesting. And the amount of anecdotes in, like, I guess anecdotes, right? You would call it that, sort of, even though it's historical, in this book, it's like thousands, and that feels like thousands and thousands of different examples.
Yeah, it's not, I've never read a sort of specifically kind of anthropological work before, so it's interesting to get that kind of background as well. You know, I'm sort of my own background is in history, I guess, really, and so history is written in a very different kind of way. So it's really interesting to see this using anthropology, so sort of the study of various societies and how they kind of organize and do things, and then use that to sort of prove more general points about the way that we think about death.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I suppose it made me really think, as you say, that everything is connected to death in some way, and sort of made me kind of, you know, sort of rethink and reframe the way I think about lots of ideas. I mean, it's a very powerful kind of argument, even though it's very sprawling and it can be in times he can meander a bit off the point before getting back to it. But it's a pretty amazing piece of work at the same time.
Yeah, and you've got a really good point. Like, well, I guess it was you, Wei, that talked about it being. No, was it you who talked about it being Squid Game? It's just very relevant to our society today, isn't it? Like,
Yeah,
with Squid Game.
Yeah.
with Squid Game.
Yeah.
Well, it's made me think about my own debts and you know, reassessing what that means and like the relationship that you have with it. You know, which I think lots of us, it's something that makes, you know, whatever personal debt we have, because everybody has it in some way, whether it's just a credit card that needs to be paid at the end of the month. But we have this really kind of complex kind of relationship with it, like this kind of idea that, you know, there's sort of guilt, and you feel like you know, you have some kind of moral imperative, like pay it back, and kind of getting away from that and not seeing it as something that, you know, seeing it as something that's not maybe as necessary as we thought to life.
Well, I mean, he does kind of like bring it to places where I'm not sure about, like, in terms of, he brings it to places like marriage being as some sort of a debt, like, because I think his suggestion, I mean, his definition of debt is almost like, if you make a promise, then you have a debt. So if you make any sort of commitment, then you have a debt to the person you committed to. He kind of brings it to that place. And I mean, I think that's why it becomes such a moral imperative to pay back the debt. I mean, well, he talks about that, like, as in, actually money is considered more important to pay back than like your marriage vows, even though they're both kind of like a debt in a way, right?
And he kind of, I think he starts off introducing the whole concept with this anecdote about, you know, why he became interested in the whole thing in the first
that was
place.
an interesting.
You remember it? Yeah.
Yes.
And I think he was talking about the way that the IMF keeps countries in the third world in permanent debt, even when they've paid that debt many times over, and it's absolutely crippling, and there's no way that they're ever going to be able to pay it back. And he was explaining this to somebody who he thinks of as, you know, probably like a liberal, probably quite left leaning, and actually working for philanthropy. And and they were talking about a situation where I think that year 7,000 children had died or something like that from as a direct consequence of austerity measures imposed on them by the IMF, that they then had to impose on their people, reducing healthcare and you know, essentially killing 7,000 children. and he suggested to this person that there should be a jubilee, or do they call it a jubilee? Like the jubilee line?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
debt
yeah. So he
jubilee. I
said it
don't know.
comes from
Amnesty.
it comes from the Bible.
Mm.
There's this idea of the Jubilee. Yeah. Mm.
And yeah, so he suggested that that debt should just be wiped off or forgiven, and he was just so surprised that the response from that person was, well, they borrowed the money, so they have to repay the debt, surely. And she said it in such a natural and instinctive way, despite being, you know, quite a nice person and considering herself to be quite a charitable person, that it kind of sent him down this rabbit hole of, you know, why is that so ingrained into our culture?
Yeah,
and our,
like why
does she even not, like, you know, why does it never cross our mind that someone could be forgiven their debt?
Yeah, why would she think that 7,000 children's lives are less important than paying back a debt? And I think that does bring us back to now. And like, that is one of the things that he talks about too, a little bit, is just debt is not always a bad thing. Like he shows lots of predatory ways in which debt is used. Slavery is like sort of a form of debt. In the way that he describes it during history. But just the idea of like the debt ceiling, for example, in the US, just being a completely made up idea, which I guess we could go into a little bit more, but my point being, like, this whole thing about the deficit myth, and the deficit, bringing it back to your point, Wei, where it's like the deficit is what sort of leads to the rationale behind like austerity. It's always like, well, how are we going to pay back? How are we going to pay that back? And it's like, who cares if people are dying? Who cares if people are homeless? I mean, the US, it's like, who cares if no one has health care? Because how are we going to pay that back? And it's just like, who gives a shit? Like, you know, people are dying now and you're like, but future generations will die. It's like, well, people are already dying. So why is that a justification for not spending?
And as if there ever will be a day where we will have zero debt.
Exactly. And well, he talks about this too. Like, okay, so now I need some clarification from you guys, like a little bit more economic minded, because I did a whole episode on the deficit myth and I still am a little bit like shaky on, I think, the logics behind the deficit. Like, for example, one of the things he does say is like, you can't have zero deficit because in the economy, that's not actually a good thing, zero deficit. And I have to say, I don't really understand that stuff, you know, that well. I have been told by people that I trust, like, that in order for the economy to work, you need to be investing. So investment equals debt equals a deficit. So
yeah, why would you ever have zero debt though? Like, unless you intend to die or something like that. Everyone.
And that's not a good thing anyway, because that means that does that just mean that the economy stops? Like, what does that mean?
I mean, it's kind of making me think of in this book, one way he talks about that is that in sort of pre-money economies, there's sort of a constant back and forth between individuals. So, you know, somebody owes somebody $4, and they sort of give them a gift that's worth $5, and then the person in turn gives them a gift that's worth sort of slightly less. So that there's always kind of a back and forth, and debt in that way is actually kind of part of sociability. So it's being in debt to your neighbors and to people in that kind of way is actually,
because he says
it's a way of sort of binding communities together.
Yeah, he says that the thing is, if you bought a gift that was exactly the same price as the gift you got, it was almost like you were saying that you wanted to finish the relationship. That the gift that you have to give in reciprocation has to be slightly less or slightly more than the gift you got. It can't be exactly the same price to the cent, which is so bizarre.
Well, I think this is that you kind of you were talking about just a couple of minutes ago about you know how death as he sees it in some senses is a good thing, or it's not a bad thing at least. And that for me is kind of the whole heart of the argument of the whole book, which is that he's kind of, how did we get from this place where debt was this thing which is actually just about, oh, you know, sort of owing your neighbors, but maybe not owing them in a very kind of strict sense, but in a general sense, but, you know, feeling some kind of moral sort of interest in the people around you in your communities. And that's how, you know, that's at the beginning of the 5,000 years, I suppose. That's where we were. And we're in the position now where somebody, as you know, Wei explained in the anecdote, you know, a person who is supposedly sort of liberal sees that it's more important to pay back a debt than it is to save human lives. So we've gone from a position where debt is something that's kind of cancelled out and not really that important, to it's actually we put a specific value on people, so you can buy and sell people with money in a way.
Do you think that she understood the 7,000 children died?
Well, from the anecdote, yeah. I mean,
like, if he actually put it out there.
No, I think he did. Yeah, I think they had just been talking about how 7,000 children. I think the other interesting point he put forward was that not only did he find it interesting that, you know, she would justify, obviously she didn't say, oh, well, they'll just have to die then, but she did not see forgiving the debt as an option. I think it was just like, how can we help them outside of this, you know? And he thought I think he kind of thinks there is almost no other thing that you could put on the table where she would think it was okay for 7,000 children to die, except it. So not only is it more important than life, it's actually the most important thing that she can think of.
Yeah, I mean, she can't imagine, like, I think in her mind, she's like, oh, but what can we do to help the children? And she just can't imagine as like forgiving the debt as a possible solution. It seems completely impossible to come to that.
I mean, what the power of this book for me is it sort of explains how we got there, you know, to you're at this point where this seems like the normal the sort of normal way of doing business, and we think it's inevitable, but you know, this, as this book really explains really well, is that it's not inevitable at all, and it was never the way, and for a long time it wasn't the way that we did business. In fact, it's not that debt in a very general sense that, you know, of course it's a good thing that you can kind of borrow things from your neighbor or your community, and then you have you feel some kind of general moral obligation to help them out in turn when you have more. That's essentially what debt was in sort of pre-money economies. But then it moves, it becomes this really kind of awful thing, which is I mean, essentially, as far as I can tell in the book, he kind of explains it that when the economy sort of permits first of all slavery and then sort of state violence and things like that, it's that that's the point of when something like debt becomes this very kind of exact, kind of cold, like calculated thing, and that we know of, that we kind of experience as today, I suppose.
Yeah, it's kind of, he does talk about when you take out the human interaction, that's when it can become extremely sociopathic. Yeah. That's why I was wondering about this lady, like, was it not explicitly said that these 7,000 children died? Like, was that not explicitly said? But then 7,000 children sometimes in your mind can feel like too abstract and too like, you know, versus one child. If it was one child put in front of her, she might have had a different answer, maybe.
Really hung up on this children's story, yeah.
Yeah, because it's so
horrific. It's also the way it's framed, isn't it? So if it's because it's framed in a way that we've been taught to think that nothing is more important than paying debt, that she's able to have this kind of view. Whereas I'm sure, like most people, even, you know, people who massive fans of the capitalist system, they would, if you said, if you framed it in a way that makes it very inhuman, like, do you think this child's life is worth $20,000? And then they would say, no, of course you would save that person. But when you frame it in terms of a debt that has to be paid back, people seem to just lose that sense of humanity for some reason.
Yeah, it's also just, it makes me think of all the Shakespearean texts about debt, like the Polonius speech about debt, and then like Merchant of Venice. I mean, it's like this whole, we've been indoctrinated by the importance of debt through so many avenues.
I think we've got an actor in the house.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And a Shakespeare professor. Did you know that? Did you know Yann was a Shakespeare professor?
One of my many careers. I don't
Shakespeare
know. But I do know Merchant of Venice, and I was thinking about it, and what it kind of made me, again, it made me sort of rethink or reassess my way of thinking about that play. And it is what I think Shakespeare is sort of making clear, is that a debt which is sort of placed or is sort of valued on a human life, or a part of human life, is like ridiculous, and you just can't pay it back, right? So that's like one of the real, that's a real key theme in the book. But it's also exactly what the debt that Antonio owes to Shylock is one that's like just not enforceable. But actually, we 300 or 400 years later, we like in a weird kind of twisted way, lots of people would say that kind of debt is enforceable. Like, it's no different to the children dying because they don't have malaria nets. So it's kind of, it's very interesting that was just at the beginning of this kind of way of thinking about.
It is really fascinating, because now I'm thinking, like, of course a pound of flesh, of course you can, because it's just like you would just have to keep paying forever, because you'd never actually be able to fulfill the requirements of that debt. And that's basically what happens with capitalism. And that brings me to Occupy Wall Street. What a brilliant segue, guys.
Nice. Well done.
I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, but basically I do think that what is fascinating about David Graeber for me, I was quite ignorant about him. I'd never heard of him before, never heard of Bullshit Jobs. I had heard of Occupy Wall Street though, but I didn't know that he was so influential within that movement. Can you guys talk a little bit more about how his ideas were influential in that movement, or any thoughts that you have about that?
So I mean, from what I gather, a lot of it is, I mean, he was one of the initial organizers. So before it was set up, in the months before, he was involved in the meetings, which kind of which led to the movement. And he was very, so a lot of Occupy Wall Street was actually directly in response to debt, and trying to sort of trying to organize around debt forgiveness and debt cancellation, and he was involved in that as well. He had a big hand in writing a sort of handbook, which was to help people getting out from underneath sort of predatory loans and so forth.
And to clarify, did he mean on an individual basis, or did he mean on a country basis, or everything?
No, a lot of it was to do with personal debt with Occupy Wall Street. Yeah, so that's where a lot of the organization came around. And of course, I mean, he's really interested in the IMF and this kind of macro debt stuff as well. But a lot of it was just these, people. It was 2011, so people were defaulting on mortgages, and they had got lots of credit card debt, and then lost their jobs and so forth. So it's, there's a real crisis around personal debt, as well as like the sort of debt of countries like Ireland and Iceland and Greece and places like that. So that was one thing. And then the other thing, which I think is really interesting, is that he was involved in the sort of thinking about the political structure of the movement itself. So Graeber is, he described himself as an anarchist. So that's like a political system which isn't, doesn't believe in hierarchy, and is sort of based around sort of consensus decision making and so forth. So a lot of the structure and the decision making that went on at Occupy Wall Street was sort of, you know, using those ideas and like trying to come up with new ways of you know, how groups can make decisions and so forth. And a lot of that was based on his ideas.
It's so funny because like
Yeah.
excuse me, I did listen to an interview with him where he talked about how Occupy Wall Street as it sort of progressed along, because it was like months, and I guess we would say that we should talk about how it's affected the rest of politics 10 years later. But, you know, as it progressed, he was saying that one of the things was that a lot of the more middle class professional people came in and sort of instituted rules and hierarchies. And as that happened, a lot of like working class or people that weren't in the professional class sort of faded away or left because they couldn't adapt to that new system. And so it was like kind of co-opted within itself into a hierarchy. And I'm curious how an anarchist sort of deals with that idea, because in my mind, it almost seems like anything in human nature sort of groups itself, not because it innately groups itself, but we as humans put meaning to things to sort things out. And so any sort of, I don't know how anarchy works en masse, you know, without someone coming in and sort of like trying to do some sort of hierarchy within that.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, it's about trying to think of a sort of a way of doing things that's so radically different. It doesn't involve hierarchical structures, which is really difficult. You know, I feel the exact same. You know, I find it incredibly difficult to think of other systems, and that's it's only very rarely when, you know, these particularly creative people come along, they're able to imagine different things.
But then they become leaders.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's any problem with having, you know, I suppose it's not thinking about them as people as leaders, but as like this facilitating conversations and
or like an inspiration, you know, rather than an authority.
Yeah, and it's difficult because there's something in human nature that tends to sort of gather around particular people, and once they have some kind of influence, then more and more people gather around them. So it's really easy to end up with hierarchical structures, even when it doesn't start out like that. Which I suppose is why something like Occupy Wall Street is so interesting, because it's this experiment, you know, where they did, at least in the early days, kind of try to do something in a different way. I was also, we were talking just before we started about disinformation, and I mean, my kind of, I suppose for a long time, my kind of overwhelming feeling, or sort of not feeling, what's the word? My impression of Occupy Wall Street was as something that had ultimately failed. You know, it was this kind of well-meaning, but you know, it had sort of eventually gone away. But of course, if you think about it, I mean, it didn't really fail. It was, you know, the last thing was happened was that they brought bulldozers into the part that they were occupying, you know, so it was very violently suppressed. And it's really interesting that kind of gets spun into, you know, oh, it's just, you know, they were well-meaning, but it sort of fizzled out.
They didn't have any ideas. You know, it was unpractical.
No, just naturally, you know, naturally the bulldozers just turned up and sort of,
and then and then like it naturally fell apart and then got physically bulldozed over as all failed ideas. As happens to all failed ideas. So
no, exactly. It's a bit like as if in, you know, when people say that, you know, I don't know, communism doesn't work in Cuba or something, like as if, you know, they're sort of ignoring the fact that there's, you know, there's an embargo and they're not allowed to. That's
so ridiculous. Yeah, but it's such a common thought process. But that does bring me to this other idea, because like David does talk about communism in his book, and I'm just curious about how he defines it in a different way, though. Like, can you sort of clarify how he sort of defines it?
Well, I mean, my understanding is that he's using it in this very kind of basic sense. So not sort of organized political communism, but just in the really general sense that you have some kind of communal bond to your neighbor, and he, I mean, at some point he describes it just as love. So that kind of that sort of community kind of thing. So it's like one form of exchange, really. So it doesn't. It's a kind of exchange when you don't necessarily expect to get anything back, but that you're doing something, or you're sort of helping people out for the benefit of a larger community.
Oh, that's
Right, there's kind of
that's-
an element of like reciprocating help and things like that. So I
yeah.
guess from that sense, you would never get, someone with 60 billion kind of chasing someone who with about 500 pounds their name for debt, and then
Right.
repossessing like their home and things like that, and everyone just going, oh, I mean, yeah, of course, like, you did pay, you didn't pay,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so yeah, that's the right thing to happen. Where I really got the sense that he talked about debt and reciprocity as yeah, debt and
Reciprocity.
reciprocity as something that is attached to communities and need and things like that, and helping each other out. And what we have now is something that is divorced from that meaning. You still have that same kind of societal expectation around it, or even a much stronger societal expectation around it, but it's been divorced from its original idea of helping each other in need and things like that.
Yeah.
That-
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I suppose the thing that allowed that change to happen is money, essentially. So when you stop, when you move from having this kind of informal credit economy to being able to sort of buy and sell anything using cash, or a debt that it takes the form of cash, then everything becomes completely impersonal. So we kind of allow ourselves to have these kind of really impersonal, kind of inhuman thoughts about what other people need, and yes, and the way that we exchange things with people has become completely impersonal, and it's thanks to money.
Yeah, it kind of does make me think though of like his anarchist ideas, and I guess do you think he would call himself a communist as well? He seems to
I don't think in the political sense at all.
not
Maybe
in the, but
it's
sort
not,
of in that love sense.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So in the, I mean, in the book, he uses the term to sort of explain that one particular type of exchange. I don't think he's kind of, in the book at least, he's not really using it as like a system of politics, or even a way of kind of being, but rather just to explain this is one way in which everybody is communist, in that non-political sense. Like we all,
He
the
seems
richest
to
person in
just
the
say
world
it's
has
so much more common and so much more like natural than the way that we've been sort of indoctrinated to think of communism. But I do still think that it is interesting to look at Chinese communism and this idea of because yes, there's some very authoritarian. Oh, I can never say that word. Authoritarianist aspects to the CPC. There is, but there's also a very cultural sense of this communism that he is talking about, which I find fascinating.
That
because
is true, isn't it?
Yeah, because there's this idea of like calling the police because my electricity is not working. It's like this idea of, and then also the way that they alleviated poverty was to go to send officials to different very poverty-stricken areas to just figure out what they needed. And to, you know, and it was like very little things too. I
Mm.
mean, not little for them because it was their livelihood, but little in terms of the scope of like society. Like here or in the West, we tend to think of help in terms of, you know, I don't know, like passing a huge bill, like the $2 trillion bill. Oh, we're sort of helping people, but it's not going to be like someone coming to your village or your suburbs or whatever. I don't know what they would call. What would you call like a village? I don't know. You wouldn't really call it anything of it.
Exactly. And what you just said kind of makes me think that, you know, when people talk about like a difference in Eastern culture, in the East, they are so the focus is on harmony and community, and in the West, it's all about individualism. And I never really actually bought that fully. And now you say it, it kind of just makes me think this idea that Western people are individualists is just an excuse to not help people.
Mm-hmm. But it's,
You know, because I do think in like, if you go back far enough, you will find like similar kind of village structures, and I highly doubt that they would be any less reciprocal
right
than an Asian village would. Like I'm sure small communities all work in very similar ways, to be honest.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's the in the book. I mean, it has this kind of anthropological perspective where he does look at sort of small communities and through history, and it does look like there's very similar kind of structures. It's just it's not sort of something inevitable or sort of inalienable about Western culture. It's just a situation that we've gotten ourselves into.
It's not about innate characteristics.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, it's really not about innate characteristics. It's about, and this is what I'm really interested in terms of, and I guess this sort of relates to disinformation or whatever. It's just sort of like, how do our systems and the way that we proliferate messages, how does that actually control our thinking, our cultural thinking into, you know, more individualist, selfish ways? Squid Game sort of like I haven't even watched it, but I'm gonna reference it
because it's big. So
it's big, but also because I'm understanding that it's like a competition.
Yeah.
Right. No. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm understanding that it's some sort of competition.
Yeah.
For survival and debt, because of survival and debt.
Exactly. I mean, most of the characters in the who are in this sort of hellish kind of game, they're in debt. So that's
right. That's why they're in the game, right?
Yeah. So they sort of they sort of end up there because they feel like there's no other way out at all. And they sort of end up in this either huge debt or a sort of small debt on the level of a person. And it's apparently there's a huge personal debt crisis in South Korea, and so it's a Korean TV show.
Society. I mean, have you guys watched Parasite?
Yeah. So I think it's kind of quite similar themes. And sort of an underclass of people that are.
Yeah, the analysis of South Korean society. I think it's really interesting.
And what's the one with the train?
Train to Busan?
No, that's a zombie movie, but there's another one which is about like a train and it has Chris Evans in it. And no, okay, I'm good. But
Chris
anyway,
Evans.
Yeah.
I think you need to Google it.
Okay, I will in a second. But like, and there's another anti-capitalist one from Korea, which is also from Bong Joon-ho, isn't it? It's Okja.
Oh, that looks like a vegetarian thing.
Yeah. There's like a lot of leftist allegory, well, very kind of on the nose, like anti-capitalist, like kind of allegories coming out of it.
Okay, so I have a question about Squid Game, having not watched it. Do you think that, because there's so much talk about it being anti-capitalist, but is it anti-capitalist, well, anti-imperialist like the Hunger Games, where You know, I'm wondering how many people who, because The Hunger Games was a YA novel really initially, and then a set of movies. But I really wonder how many youth watched that or read that and thought like, oh, maybe I should challenge the imperialist system. Like, I don't know. I wonder about that.
Well, I don't know. Gen Z are supposed to be more leftist, aren't they? So maybe it works.
Maybe that's why it's so popular, you think?
But yeah, no, I don't think Squid Game's anti-imperialist. I think it's more about personal debt, as far as I could see anyway. I mean, I think there is a section where they talk about like the relationship between Korea and like the UN Security Council nations, or they don't talk about it, but like there are representatives of countries who just happen to be on the UN Security Council, and they kind of depict Korea as being bullied by those countries, which are like the US, Japan, China, who else is on it? France. So yeah, but I don't know if that's really the point.
That's kind of funny. I mean, if the idea that's a little bit unself-aware of the, you know, because we all know that South Korea aligned itself with America.
Yeah.
So to think that it's just all the countries against South, you know, it's
right. Yeah. Well, that's how they must perceive it. But yeah, to be honest, like, it's not like the US and China gang up in Korea together. It's separate powers. Yeah.
Obviously not. But there is a real anti-capitalist streak in the show.
Well, the whole, I mean, yeah, as Wei said, it's an allegory, so it's like this really extended kind of metaphor of the whole thing is a fight, you know, to the death,
right,
and you know, of these people who are in lots of debt. So you know, it's a very kind of obvious kind of metaphor for like people just living these kind of rat race lives, you know, and sort of fighting amongst each other and not against like a sort of a bigger evil. It's kind of in the background.
I mean, yeah, that's, and who do they say is the bigger evil? Because that's,
well, the organizers of the game. So there's like, you know, there's kind of a sort of a almost of godlike kind of yeah, it's like a, I'm trying not to spoil it too much, but it's like, yeah. There's, I mean, essentially there's like a, you know, there's an organizers of the entire thing, and they sort of act like gods, and they kind of play with people, and rather than kind of ganging up against them or, you know, trying to find some other way out, they just kind of, everyone fights amongst themselves.
That's a metaphor for our society right now, I suppose. And I think like going back to Occupy Wall Street, that was kind of the idea against, I mean, that was the idea of Occupy Wall Street, was the 99% against the 1%.
Yeah.
And that's the first time, right, that sort of language was used. So I think, right? So I think that's the real influence of Occupy and
Graeber specifically, because that was his phrase, yeah.
So that's why he's so important. Okay, I get it now.
What, the 99% was Graeber's phrase?
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. According to Wikipedia and other sources.
Amazing.
Wikipedia.
That's amazing.
So yeah, the idea, I suppose, that I mean, I guess we had there was, you know, obviously kind of a movement that was, you know, lots of movements are sort of mass movements against a tiny elite, but I suppose that was the first time it was articulated in that very specific way, and you know, that it really is just tiny. It's probably 99.9% against 0.1, really, isn't it, in lots of ways, and that's kind of articulating it in that kind of way was really powerful, because it made everybody realize that it's, you know, it's really a teeny tiny number of people who hold like by far the largest amount of money.
Because I think even now, like the rhetoric, I don't know about here, but in the US, kind of like whenever it's there's some sort of, you know, like this recent thing, now it's a $2 trillion bill, you know, but this idea, it's always like, yeah, but they're going to tax the middle class. There's always this idea. And then really it just came out, and I don't know how long the statistic has been true, but that it's like the 1% owns more than the 90% of people's, like all the wealth in the US. The 1% owns more money than the 90% of the population in the US. So that's insane. Yeah, so that idea is like, obviously if you just tax that 1% more,
That's
there's
enough.
so many things. Yeah.
So it's not just that, it's not a drop in the ocean, which is sometimes the way it gets fed, isn't it? It's like, oh well, it's not going to make that much of a difference if we tax the 100 richest people, but actually it does make a difference. I guess it's also, I mean, it is in some ways it's kind of a controversial phrase, if you think about because it sort of lumps in the 99% kind of includes people who are who are probably quite comfortable with people who have very little. And of course it's good in some ways, but it's also I guess it's good to also recognize that within that 99% that some people are really pretty screwed, and some people are in very different kind of sort of economic positions.
Because you still have you're still going to have the huge familial intergenerational wealth in that top 5%. That
I think even like talking about 5% is probably is probably pretty tricky, because I think there is more difference between the bottom end of the top 1% and the top end of the top 1%, where on the bottom end you've probably got people on like 150k or something like that, and the top end is almost unlimited, so like even within that,
exactly. I mean, at the same time, there's not a huge amount of difference in sort of absolute standards of living terms between somebody who's in the bottom of the 1% and at the top of the 1%. I mean, they have more giant mansions, but in both cases they have all of their basic living standards met to like a pretty high degree. But yeah, it's more complex. It's a simple but very effective slogan.
Yeah, I mean, like that. Well, it wouldn't be as catchy if they said the 99%, but this, but that.
Yeah, exactly.
It would be just like
we are the 99%, but we recognize that within that there is a whole spectrum of different levels of.
And also
it wouldn't make a very good banner. That's the problem. Yeah.
And also, it's just like, again, it's just like, why do we? It's that whole thing that you're saying about Squid Game. I guess it's like the idea that we're going to divide and then fight against each other. Like, why bother fighting against the top, 10% or whatever, versus that 1% that probably really controls all the markets in the world, etc. I mean, we're talking about, and there's also like Wei was saying, this huge difference between the 1% and then I think even the 97th percentile or whatever. There's like, but yeah, they're comfortable and they're fine. But that's not the point, right? Like, I don't know. That's not the point to just make. Even of communism, not to just make everybody suffer. That's like not the point of that.
No, exactly. It's to give everybody what they need according to what they're able to do, and there's so many other interesting things that I want to talk about today. So another thing that kind of, as I was reading this, I'm kind of interested and really furious with the universal credit system in the UK.
Oh yeah.
So, which is like, it's basically this. There's a complex social welfare system, and they decided in 2010 to simplify it, as they said. They're going to get rid of all these like different payments and just make one payment. But again, as reading.
So is that why it's called universal credit? Because that really confused me.
Well, I think it's a confusing phrase. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's not universal basic income. It's something.
No.
What is it actually?
Well, it's the. I mean, I wouldn't say it's the opposite, but it's basically like it's the basic social welfare payment that you get if you're unemployed. So that's, called in lots of different countries the dole or welfare checks or whatever in different countries. And lots of countries have different ways of dealing with it. But what I found really interesting is that when I thought about it after reading this book, is that they sort of changed it from a system. It used to be called they had a few names, but one of them was job seekers allowance. So it's an allowance. And so what they did, just around the time actually of as Graeber was writing this book, they changed it into a system of credit. So it's like they're sort of co-opting the whole world of like debt into the social welfare system. So something that's before is seen as as an entitlement, which as it should be, becomes something that you owe debt now to society. So it's like this credit that you're being given and you have to pay back.
Because it's not a credit. Why is it called a credit?
No, because you're getting credit, like as in like they're saying you as an unemployed person are borrowing money from the government. Is that what they're saying?
You're not going to pay it back, though.
No, but you do. They claw it back, don't they? Do they?
Well, yeah, of course. Through, the whole idea is that it's that by paying taxes and in the UK by paying national insurance, you're always paying into it.
But that's stupid, because now I'm like, well, in that case, everyone should be on it because we've all paid into it then. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I guess we're paying into it so that there is so because we're paying into a system that will then allow us to use it if we need to, if that's what we need, for whatever reason.
Yeah, but if you put it in those terms, I think like now it's like, oh, well, I actually specifically, okay, probably not me because I haven't been here for a while, but and a British person that pays taxes here would be like, yeah, I've been paying this specifically for years, and now I'm gonna get it out of it. Isn't that like? It's less about.
No, I think we think about it as as a like an insurance premium or something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly.
But it's nothing to do with because sorry, go ahead.
Well, what's interesting for me is that by changing the name and the way it works into this kind of language of credit and debit, they make it into this kind of moral thing. Like it's this is something that you don't it's not an entitlement that we're giving you. It's like this thing that you have to pay back. Like maybe not specifically pay it back, but it's now a moral debt that you owe the government and that you owe the rest of society. And that's like this really kind of insidious way of like thinking about social welfare.
It's also not very much, is it?
No, it's terrible. And the other thing is, even more specifically than that, the system itself is built around debt. So there's a 5-week waiting time once you become unemployed. And like if you've ever been broke, like 5 weeks is like a laughable amount of time to not have any income. Like it's just it's a joke. So they allow you to borrow money from the system. And so most people, not most, but almost half of the people on universal credit or a third of them are in arrears and they're paying it back every month. So they built the whole system. They built kind of debt into the entire system. So that's
debt is prison type of mentality.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, no, I think it's such a good example of what Graeber is kind of talking about, is that by sort of turning things from something that's human, that we like social welfare is an entitlement that we should be, we should all be able to use when we need it and then pay back into it when we have the means. From turning it into something which is just this kind of language of like debit and credit and
because welfare versus credit, that's very different. You're right.
Yeah, no, it says a lot about the kind of political system that was in place around the time that it began.
It's like language is so important. It's just like in the US, it would be benefits versus, which is such a weird thing, versus entitlements. Or, I guess entitlements is also used in a negative way as well. So, gosh, just terrible. I don't know.
I just have that Squid Game like thing rotating in my head. The song where it's like Mokongwa gobi dia da da da. Sorry, Leanne, you're like totally out the loop, but that's your fault
That
for
is
being
my
such a
fault. I should have
hipster.
watched that
It
first.
is. Don't be such a hipster and be like, I'm not watching it because everyone else likes it.
No, it's just that it has subtitles, so I have to pay attention.
Do you know what? I did think that, but like, I mean, all these American people are watching it, all these American kids, so it must be, can't be that hard, you know?
No, I mean, I watch lots
But
of
Americans
things with
hate subtitles. Yeah, but Americans hate
no,
subtitles,
I think
right?
that's
And
not
yeah,
true anymore because of Netflix. Like, I think it's just
Yeah.
exposure. But I watch
Mm.
lots of things with subtitles, but I can't multitask. That's all.
Yeah, it's hard.
You
I
can't
found it
multitask.
hard to not be able to look at my phone and watch it at the same time.
Or if I'm
Well, that's why
supposed to be
it's
doing
violent.
Mm.
like, I don't really like violence.
But I mean, it's not violent, but it's like dramatic, you know, like it's not gory, but it's like people
Okay,
die.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
It's not slow
it's
moving.
tense. Yeah.
Sure.
It's not.
Yeah.
There's no dead air. Yeah.
So do we therefore think that now we decided that Occupy Wall Street was in fact successful in a way? I mean, honestly, it just feels like the world is worse now, but I'm not sure if it is worse or I know more. I think it is worse, to be honest.
Oh yeah, it is worse. Yeah.
Objectively, yes.
I mean, like the problems that, I don't know. I think that the financial industry got regulated, but then they got regulated in ways, yeah, they were very heavily regulated, but then
Wow. I didn't know that.
there will be, I mean, inequality is greater. I think the banks are less likely to go down. Like that's as in they're less likely to over leverage themselves and just suddenly go bust like that. So they don't take the same risks that they did, but has it done anything for inequality? I don't. Yeah, so I think the banks, the financial industry is regulated, so it's less risky, and that they're less likely to go down and need a bailout, I guess.
Really? So do you think they're more regulated and they actually change their ways?
Yeah. In the sense that like they used to take huge risks with people's money. I think that was one of the key themes of the 2008 credit crunch, and they're no longer allowed to take those risks. So are you going to lose your pension because some, fund manager was gambling with it? You probably are less likely for that to happen. But that does not mean that the inequality aspect of it was addressed, or that the world is any more humane. It's just that particular way of speculating has been cracked down on.
What about Evergrande?
I do not know about Evergrande. No, I just can't deal with this news thing after news thing after news thing.
Yeah. Also, the other thing is on Evergrande, the Western news is very different from Chinese news because my mom watches Chinese news, and her understanding of it is completely different from anything I read.
Well, I basically didn't bother to read anything because I find it really hard to read most things about China in the Western press. So I was obviously I could just see headlines and it was Evergrande is China's Lehman Brothers default. It's going to bring down the whole of it. Is China over? And I'm seeing these headlines and I'm just they say that every single week, every single thing bad that happens in China, it's is China over in the Western press. And then today I look at the financial news and it's Evergrande is bouncing back. The shock is over, and I'm of course it is, because you were overplaying it the whole time, So I don't know.
Yeah,
didn't bother to follow. I mean, surprise, surprise! It wasn't such a bad deal after all. Yes,
pretty healthy way to think about it.
I mean, meanwhile, my mom's Oh, they've known about, like in China, they've known about it for a year and they've been dealing with it. Like versus in the West, it's like, oh my God, it just happened. You know, it's like so different. It's funny. But go ahead.
I mean, yeah, I was going to say that something else about debt, the book, not the concept, was I really liked the sort of non-Western focus that Graeber at least tried to kind of bring into it. So, I mean, even in I don't know if you noticed, but he called the chapters about Europe, he called it the Far West. So he's kind of thinking about which it was, from the perspective of like most of that 5,000 years of history, it was this kind of backwater where people were like living in mud huts, and all the sophistication was in India and China and then Middle East, or maybe not that way around, but the other way around, and that it was really interesting. It wasn't maybe so essential to the kind of main point, but just to hear that that China and India in particular had these very sophisticated kind of systems which were much more humane in lots of ways than what was happening in Europe at the same time, which would have, from their perspective, would have just seemed like this really kind of backwards, barbaric place. It was interesting. It's only at the end of the book really he kind of turns to Europe, Western Europe, and as this place which has kind of managed to like industrialize all of these terrible things, and bring back the kind of the slavery cycle, kind of thing. So
he seemed like really cool. Like did you watch any of the YouTubes? Because he just seemed like such a really personable, nice, humble and smiling. Even though he is snarky, he's actually very likable, which is like
find him snarky.
His books are snarky. Like I think he's snarky, but like in a nice way. Like and he also just likes to kind of challenge. He likes to challenge. Yeah, it's your baseline. He likes to challenge like things that a lot of academics just take as for granted, and I like because I cheated a bit and I looked at his other book called The Dawn of Everything, which is a collaboration with him and I think a professor who specializes in town planning or architecture or something like that. So it's by David Graeber and David Begner. Yeah. So it's like a cross-disciplinary kind of book, and I read the first chapter, and what I really thought was interesting was, first of all, his kind of dismissal of the kind of common sense, kind of predominant take that just seemed really unchallenged and was promoted by Francis Fukuyama about kind of the inevitability of where we are now and how it just ties into human nature and this narrative where, we are like, either you are in a hunter-gatherer society, but, with the agricultural revolution, you had the ability to produce more than you could consume. So then you get hierarchy and structures, and then you get sexism because, and all these qualities get magnified and industrial revolution, and then where we are now. And this idea that that with societal progress and cities, we always necessarily have to have inequality because inequality is a natural byproduct of being able to produce more than you can consume. And he says that's bullshit. And he brings in several examples of societies throughout history where they did organize it into large cities. I think he takes Mesopotamia as like an example, and there are new discoveries of archaeological discoveries which change people's views all the time. And he says that there were pretty egalitarian societies in very sophisticated cities in the ancient world. And this is evidenced by like a lack of really huge monuments, like a Tutankhamun kind of thing, or like, this really like single person worship and huge kings. He says that's not necessarily inevitable and hasn't necessarily been the case in many ancient sophisticated societies. And then this thing I think you touched on earlier about there being like people tending to gravitate around leaders. And he also kind of talks about how that doesn't necessarily have to be true either. And there are some, he takes the example of like seasonality. So he says that in some tribes, they are more hierarchical during the summer and less hierarchical during the winter, or vice versa, and more matriarchal in some seasons, and
That's
depending on, yeah, I suppose it depends on the situation, the competence of a given person during that situation.
right.
So when you're hunting
The
the
ability to
person,
adapt.
yeah, exactly. So
I mean,
you have hierarchies, but then you have, I think what makes something, and we were talking about Occupy Wall Street and the hierarchy in Occupy Wall Street, and I think, yes, people do gather around leaders, but I don't know if that's necessarily I think that the word here is rigid, a rigid hierarchical structure, which means someone is always senior to another person permanently, versus when we naturally just take leadership of different things when we decide that we're competent.
So it's sort of ad hoc kind of organizational structures instead of there being, as they say, kind of a rigid one, and which seems like a much better way to organize things. That when your abilities kind of if it suits your particular abilities, that you become the responsible person or whatever.
yeah, I mean, you adapt for success, and I guess like I've heard the argument being made that the Bernie Sanders movement, which I think is actually no longer a Bernie Sanders movement, to be honest, wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Occupy Wall Street. So it's kind of like not so much that that is the only trajectory of Occupy, but it was like one trajectory in politics. And then there are other ways in which, probably organizations, different political parties, etc., that are coming out, was also influenced by like the whole 99% thing. So it doesn't have to be one movement. And in fact, it cannot be one movement, because one movement, like with Bernie Sanders, I think that was kind of the issue, is that the establishment could see how to weaponize against Bernie Sanders. And so if it's only one movement and one leader, it's too easy to defeat. It's got to be like several in different areas. So there's still hope.
Way it's your sort of description of the book earlier is really interesting. That it sounds like it's sort of a counterpoint to these popular history books like Steven Pinker and Yusuf Harari and people like that. It's all about it's like a progressive sort of myth of everything is progressive, like we move from being kind of less sophisticated to sort of an end point, and that there's some kind of inevitability that every culture and society moves in those particular ways.
Oh, you mean like every culture and society will move towards where we are, which is like
exactly, like we go
versus
so like going through being sort of starting off as a sort of a peasant economy and then becoming enlightened and having sort of liberal values and so forth, industrial revolution,
and there's no sort of like idea of like, oh, you might have that perception because you are in this specific
well, also just the idea that that's not the way it works in practice, is it? That sometimes it goes backwards, as this book shows, in like we kind of go between periods of
like they tried paper money, or they tried in China at some point, and then they stopped at some point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not like this kind of inevitable kind of train of momentum that's going forward then. And it also, different parts of the world develop in different ways, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to end up at the same point. And that's like, that's another, it's a really interesting kind of, there's some kind of dichotomy there, isn't there, between people who think that everything is kind of progressively getting better, and then but actually
Right.
and people think that it's actually much more complicated than that, and that what we think of as progressive society or politics isn't always like the best way of kind of doing things.
No, yeah. I mean, you even kind of notice that in things like women's rights or LGBTQ rights. You would think that LGBTQ people have more rights now than they ever have in the past. And I don't know, look, you know, there are times when things have been, you know, more
Well, like
conservative and less
abortion.
conservatives in the past. Yeah. There are, you know, there are many things today many trends today which are happening, which are causing, you know, places to become less and less socially liberal, and you know, less amenable to women and things like that. So yeah, there have definitely, you know, there's always an ebb and flow, and things that, well, ebb and flow still makes it sound linear, and it's not. It's not linear at all. It's kind of just, you know, more like
That's true.
things popping up here and there, like
yeah, it's more ad hoc, and it's kind of getting away from the idea that this kind of Western, like what we call like rationality, is like this ultimate kind of goal of things. You know, that there's some kind of perfect way that we can organize everything, and if we just figure that out, that everything would be great.
Yeah, and also that we've actually kind of figured it out. I mean, that's the assumption, is that we have kind of figured it out as much as humankind can possibly have figured it out. And so we just have to keep going in this particular trajectory. Like that's what all those history books that you're talking about suggest, right? Which I think is really fascinating, because that means that we have no ability to adapt to our current crises, because it's like capitalism has to be the best possible outcome, because this is where, you know, we're at that place. So we've learned from thousands of years, and this is versus like, oh, you know what, it's actually failing at the moment. And so
or if they agree it's failing, they think that the solution is just to be sort of more rational and more progressive about it, rather than that maybe there's something, you know, there's other ways of thinking about it, which, you know,
well, what is more rational?
I'm not saying that I know what these things
right,
are.
Yeah, but like even the idea of what's more rational, like,
well, I guess if you can, you know, somebody who agrees that the capitalist system is broken but also thinks that it's the best thing might say that, oh, we just need to be smarter about how we kind of organize the markets. Well, another thing we haven't really talked about is well, I mean, I know we sort of briefly talked about the bullshit jobs thing, but actually, I mean, the debt itself ends with this kind of, you know, he says, actually, I don't know if the version that you read, if it was the newer version with an afterword, which he wrote a few years afterwards, but he kind of ends it with this being in praise of the non-industrious poor. So it's like trying to, you know, the idea
Yes.
that
Nice.
so that's, I guess it's part of that progressive thing, isn't it? It's that we're always, you know, it's okay to be poor as long as you're productive, and that's, you know, that's fine. But actually, we're moving to a place where, you know, endless growth is just destroying the planet, and it's not necessarily a good thing to always be productive and to be constantly making new wealth. And that, you know, maybe we should start being less productive in some ways, and, changing like the way we think about those things, which is I think that's where his ideas about the bullshit job thing comes from, really, isn't it? You know, way you kind of read more into it.
No, I didn't take away more than that, but I love that idea. And I think also with the Extinction Rebellion, like, who was it that they were always telling everyone to read? It was Jason Hickel, wasn't it?
Oh, was that?
I think one of their, I think it's Jason Hickel that they're always telling.
Really? Well, because he
telling,
does have a new book that is about the environment.
it's about degrowth. Yeah. So I think.
And he talks about debt a lot too.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah, I think it is Jason Hickel, degrowth. Less is more. Less is more.
Less is more, yeah.
So talking basically about how, like, our increasing living standards predicated on, increasing living standards of the middle and upper class are predicated on the growth of the economy and like our pensions and everything like that, sort of predicated on that, and how that's just not, it's not going to be possible to maintain kind of that pace without completely just destroying the planet.
Well, it's only a very small number of us that live in this kind of way anyway, isn't it? Yeah,
and I can't remember who it was that was actually saying that they don't think that a socialist or equitable revolution would ever happen from a Western country, because even the poorest of us are still kind of not in as dire a place as people in the third world. So it would never really get enough momentum. It would never get really that desperate for the system to be overthrown.
yeah.
And all they would need to do would be to just satisfy, I guess, everyone in the first world. And that's entirely possible, but it would absolutely be at the expense of everybody in the third world.
Well, he kind of does talk about how debt keeps the, and I would say maybe more of the first world in this cycle of, you know, because you have to pay your mortgage, you have to pay whatever. So you have to keep, instead of staging a revolution or whatever, you have to kind of keep within that
keep you busy,
hamster wheel. Yeah. But having said that, like in the US, it's like Striketober. So I don't know about here, but I don't know about here in the UK.
What's Striketober?
Well, essentially a lot of companies are striking in the US. Like John Deere is striking. I think Kellogg's, I don't know if they've wrapped that up. The film and television people, IATSE or something, almost went in a strike. They're kind of like in the bargaining phase of that. There's the other company that sells like biscuits. I can't remember their name. So, and then this whole year it's been like Frito-Lay has gone on strike. So many companies have gone on strike. Tyson's, Amazon, I guess, like in a small part of it. So
that's really interesting. Yeah,
never heard of it.
It sounds like something's kind of changing.
Well, the mainstream media doesn't really cover it that much.
Have they? I'm sure they've always had strikes. I mean, no, like in the
not
Simpsons.
as much as this year, I don't think. And part of it is COVID.
That's true. Yeah, people are just more comfortable with like getting out there and getting the placards.
Yeah, well, it's also you have this this kind of change in the way that people can demand more wages, can't they? Because there's like a labor shortage. So I was just recently working on a project looking at the Great Plague of London in 1665, and through that, like sort of looking at like what happens after plagues throughout history, and you get, I mean, the kind of, well, the classic story is that it gets afterwards it gets better for ordinary workers because there is this huge labor shortage and people can demand increased rights and increased pay. I mean, it's probably not that simple, but that's there is an element.
I mean,
of,
the problem was like, was it last year or this year that British gas engineers went on strike, and then they didn't get anything. Like, it really sucked that they basically lost their previous. I mean, they weren't even asking for more than their previous contract. They were, their contract was being decreased. So they were just striking to get back to their normal status quo, and they lost still. Which really is during COVID. I think maybe also because there was no media coverage, so there was no mass outcry, and that's how they're controlling all these strikes in a way. So that's not. And I mean, the thing that is sort of interesting about this year's strikes for me, just because I'm quite ignorant about the working conditions in just anywhere, but also in the US, like a lot of the working conditions that I suddenly brought to my knowledge, I guess, or my awareness, was just like the same sort of stuff that, suicide shifts, etc. Everything that America has been accusing China for years. Now it's sounding like, oh my God, the US has been doing this for God knows how long. I mean, like the Frito-Lay strike, they had like something like, they called it the suicide shift. That's what they were trying to get rid of. And they had something like 1 day off in 3 months or something like that. And they just came away with like 1 day off a week or something. It was not even a normal, they didn't come away with like, oh, great working conditions. They just came away with a little tiny incremental change, but really not in anyone's estimation like good working conditions for workers. So it's kind of,
I don't know if you remember I don't know if you the sports direct. There was a story in the Guardian a few years ago that another corporate journalist went in and sort of described the conditions, but it was it was just it was really all these, as you say, all these things that Western countries accuse others of doing.
oh God! So did they sort out the issues with Sports Direct, or?
They didn't. There was no. I don't think there was any labor organization. I think they just there was just this story in the Guardian, and after there was some controversy, so they there was no mass strike movement or anything. I'm not sure if they really changed much.
I think there was a lawsuit, wasn't there? So it was basically like technically because they would not include the time that you need to get ready. So you had to
and to be checked by security
for work,
stuff,
to be checked. So they had this queue, this line that would basically mean that it took you sort of 20 minutes to start work and 20 minutes to end work, and they would say that you had to do all of that before like your starting time. So they're basically adding like 20 minutes, half an hour on the start and the end, and that if you average that out, then you're paying less than the minimum wage. So I think they had to abandon that.
Yeah, exactly.
But minimum wage in the UK is extremely low still. It's like £7, isn't it? 25 or something.
Something like that. Depends. It's more, a little bit more if you're in London, but it's lower. It depends on your age as well. If you're between 16 and 18, it's lower. But it's pretty difficult to survive on for sure.
Gosh, yeah, okay. Well, that's terrible.
What a downer.
What a downer. Turns out debt is not really a good thing.
Yeah.
I mean, apart from that one instance where we said it was for the economy.
Well, I think it's okay to be in debt to your neighbor in that kind of way.
Yeah.
I mean, and I do kind of agree with that. It's not just that it's a good thing, but there's something kind of nice and social about like feeling like you have like shared like responsibilities to each other. Like, oh, I owe this person down the road this, so someday I should do something for them, and without it being kind of like formalized. I think it's good, and it's also true that like some types of business they run on credit. Like, so if you own a cafe, you get your coffee beans on credit from your suppliers, and then you sell them to your customers, and then you're able to pay back. And that's there's nothing maybe inherently wrong with like that kind of like low level, it's interest free kind of like commercial debt. It's like it's one way of it means that we can kind of do things, but it's just we've turned it into this monster. It's like a monstrous system.
No, I think I've sort of realized that being in debt to your community is quite nice, actually. The book kind of made me think about sort of, because yes, I'm a gentrifier, I live in an ex-council flat, but there is kind of still like a working class community around in this block, and it feels really nice the way that they do help each other out. And actually, when my electricity went out for a day, all I had to do was text the group, and I was just flooded with all these sort of offers of for help, and like Violet, the lady who lives sort of on the block, really forced me to take these candles from her, and I was just like, no, it's fine. But actually, it did start getting dark, and I did actually end up using it because it was dark. Like, I was obviously fine during the day, But
Yeah.
as it started to get dark and cold, it actually did feel pretty horrible. And then I actually did use the candles that she lent me. And then I have other neighbors who will ask me to cat sit and just very proactively just say, oh, would you mind cat sitting for me? You know, and it just seems like a very kind of natural thing for this community to do, to ask favors. And I think it's really, really interesting because it's not something that it's not the kind of environment that I've ever lived in.
You wouldn't call it debt, but I think in some ways that's what it is. But it's just it's like yeah, exactly. It's like something that binds you to other people, which is a good thing. There's in the Netherlands, they if you go like do anything with a group of people, like go for drinks or I don't know, to the cinema or something, one person pays, and then they have this thing. It's an app called Tiki, and then after you've gone, like you take a picture of the receipt, say if it's a meal or something, and then you send a message on WhatsApp to say, oh, can you pay me back on Tiki for this thing? And this is, everybody does this, like every single time you go out, you get a Tiki the next day. And I don't really like it. I find it, I mean, I think I kind of struggle with that. Well, yeah, and it's doing exactly that thing where you go back to zero. You know, nobody owes anybody anything.
But
Like
that's so
I'm
funny
coming from
because
like
that is
Ireland,
Dutch
where
culture.
people always
going Dutch, yeah.
Yeah, that is so Dutch
It is,
culture.
yeah, exactly. It's
They
totally
literally,
true.
so they actually do go Dutch then.
They do go Dutch.
What?
Yeah.
What a bunch
Like,
of stingy
strictly,
people.
No, but they're
Just kidding.
famous for being very exacting.
Yeah.
And I wonder about
Yeah.
their history of like, well, they had like a huge history of imperialism, colonialism.
Yeah.
So that's
Maybe
like
that's it. Well, in Japan, they're also very accurate, I have to say.
Oh my
like,
gosh. And they're also colonialism.
they split the bill down to the 1 yen. Like,
Yeah, it's the same here.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
the same. Yeah,
It's mad. I'm sure. I think the Germans as well. I'm not sure. Or is that just me being like stereotypy? But the Japanese definitely. The Japanese definitely. Yeah.
Well, I think part of it, I mean, it doesn't fully hold, but I think just being from big urban kind of centers where things are quite impersonal in that way, so you don't necessarily know your neighbors. Whereas coming from Ireland, where you would never do that because you would just know like the next time like this person would get it, and then it's just the way things work.
That's so true of this book then. That's this whole idea of the book is like the debt is a continuing relationship versus, because you might not see those Dutch people again.
No, it's true. Or at least you don't feel that you have any connection to them in that way. You could, if you, it's a strange thing to say, but if you wanted to, you could cut off all contact really easily because you don't feel like you don't feel like you owe them anything. I know it's kind of a slightly strange way to think about like our behavior, but I guess maybe
but
there's
it's
a point
true because I do, if somebody does buy me a lunch or something, then I'll be like, well, now I have to get you a lunch. I mean, I do think about it.
Yeah.
That is really true. Yeah. Good. Do you think we covered everything?
I think so. The only we didn't talk about student debt, which is like another interesting thing. And then
oh my god.
Yeah. I mean, I'm lucky in that I don't have any, but I know for lots of people it's like this big crazy kind of.
I mean, the US, it's insane because Sallie Mae, which is like this huge lender in the US, they can call you at your work. I mean, can you imagine? To like chase you off and stuff. Yeah, and call your parents and stuff.
In the US, it's like, is it like private companies that just lend you money? I mean, is it?
I'm confused about it because I think
it's
that it's a government agency that works as if it's private, but actually that's why when they say you can just forgive the debt, you really can, because it doesn't, there's no, it's just a few numbers on some computer in the government system. So it's again completely, I mean, I think people do tend to think of student debt, student loans as like this middle class issue. And it's just very short-sighted to think of it that way, because obviously if it might be a middle class issue now, but if you got rid of it, and you gave people free education, then people that, you know, are less well off can actually go to college. And because people do factor that into what they study as well. Like, you know,
Yeah.
for obvious reasons.
Is it going to be worth it? Like,
yeah, am I going to be
will I
able to
get a
pay this
return on
off?
this money?
Yeah,
Yeah.
in my lifetime.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's all part of. I mean, in some ways, it's they brought in the student loan system so that people from less well-off backgrounds could go to university. But it's not very good if they're just doing that by making all these less well-off people get into lots of debt. And often for a university degree, that won't kind of it won't be worth
Yeah.
their while in the long run.
And it has interest, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Load with
I know.
Yeah,
I was kind
definitely
of
does.
shocked.
Yeah, that's quite a
Yeah.
lot, quite high. Yeah.
That's insane. It shouldn't
Is it initially low, but can become quite high? Like,
yeah, and it changed as well. I looked into it. There's a new system since like 2012 or something, and it's sort of, I think it changes over time. But I mean,
Are you talking
it's
about
obviously
the UK here?
the UK one. Yeah,
Yeah,
the
okay.
UK. I don't really know much about the US. Just seems like the same system but magnified.
It's going to be worse. Yeah, whatever it is, it's going to be the same system worse.
Yeah.
That's like basically sums up the entire US and the UK. Which is great.
Yeah.
I thought that education was still free in certain sectors in the UK. No longer.
No, it's not.
No.
It's no. It's you have to pay fees, and they brought in a system where they said, okay, you can, if you at the most you can charge this amount, but obviously there's going to be we expect you to have different rates depending on the course because some are more expensive than others, and like straight away all the universities just charged the full cap to everybody as much as they possibly could. It's crazy. I mean, the universities are they're underfunded, but that's the student loan system is not going to pay for it, and it shouldn't.
Why are the universities underfunded?
I mean, I guess it's just incredibly expensive to run. They have lots of huge overheads, like big admin bills. They some of them obviously do quite well with research funding, but that's only a tiny percentage. Like Oxford and Cambridge are obviously, they're not broke, but the ordinary university, which doesn't have like partnerships with companies, and it doesn't have like huge research grants because nobody kind of knows about them. They're like struggling for money, but then they run it like these, they sort of run them as sort of neoliberal corporations. So they're headed by somebody whose main job is just to try and make the thing financially
run it as a business,
secure, and they do that. Yeah, completely. That's like and it's like the ideology at the top is just that these things should be profit making and will do anything to make it so.
I wonder what the Chinese system is like, because there's been so many, I've been reading so much about how like they're STEM graduates, they're engineers, they're just churning them out. So I just really am curious, like maybe the financial incentive, they have financial incentives.
I wonder if it's just subsidized. I'd like to know.
Yeah,
because like it just seems to me that, I don't know, because I only meet people from China who come here, so
they're probably well off.
I mean, they're probably middle class already, but it does. I don't even want to say, like, I wonder if the government just like.
I think there are some universities that are just completely subsidized because they are so competitive to get into, like the main ones.
There is a lot of competition.
And then there are private ones for the people who can't get into those main ones because of the competition.
Did they? You know what was quite like interesting though? There's a couple of things that that they banned in China like 2 months ago that I think people tried to report negatively on, and it was private tuition, which is one of your pet hates, Yann.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, they were trying to get rid of.
It's illegal now. You can't do night school or something. Yeah.
Really? Yeah. I mean, the whole school system in the UK is just
Mm.
based around paying people to
Tuition.
to privately tutor your child
Mhm.
to pass entrance exams to get into
Mhm.
schools. I mean, the
That's
whole thing,
crazy.
you can't even you no matter how smart you are, you can't get in without these people.
Yeah,
Which I
see,
did.
like, which you
But,
did, because you're a
yeah,
genius.
You
Well, I
facilitated
wouldn't.
it. Yeah,
I did, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't
yeah.
have even really thought about it unless I had done it for,
Mhm.
kind of on and off for a year.
Oh no,
And
you were a
realized it was
tutor. I thought you got
I
into
was
the
a tutor.
system without tutoring.
No. I mean, everyone did when I was. And there's in Ireland, there's not really such thing as good schools or bad schools. At least in primary school, there you just go
Mm.
to your local school, like they're all the same. And then
Mm.
it's not. There's no private school system, or at least the one that is there is very small, and it's not really. I don't think everybody. There's not a real desire for a lot of people to try and go to these schools. It's a slightly different thing.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to me that the Chinese, saw this system as a big enough problem to just completely ban it. And what they're saying is, on the weekend, children should spend time outside and, spend time with their families, etc. It's so interesting. But yeah. Anyway, anything else that we haven't covered that we should just before we wrap up? I think we covered most of the book.
I'm going to keep going with this with David Graeber because I think he's really, really, really interesting. Really, I definitely want to read this Dawn of the Dawn of Everything book. It seems very. It seems like a kind of.
Everything.
It seems kind of like a counter or like a nice balance to what's his name, Yuval Harari, and it seems like a nice because you go on the tube and it's just like everyone is reading *Sapiens*, and I'm just like, well, I don't know,
It's
maybe
interesting,
now, maybe like
I still haven't read that.
I've read it. It was really, really interesting. I liked it, but but everyone, it's like I would like. There must be another book too. I mean, you can't all take like the history of everything in the world like from this one book.
It's true. I saw somebody reading it last week. Yeah, it's still, but it is interesting that there's a lot of people going around with that particular worldview.
You're not allowed to read it, Ileana, because like you're only allowed to read if you read *Sapiens* past 2017, then you're just lame.
Oh no! It's one of those books that my dad talked about, and so I was like, "Oh, okay."
Too late.
Yeah, once my dad talked about it, it's always like,
move on to the next
"Oh, well,
thing.
do I have to read that?" Like, kind of. This is why I haven't.
If your
read
dad's
Das
discovered
Kapital.
like *Sapiens* or like TikTok, then it's just over.
So like, he keeps telling me
faster.
to read Marx as well.
I mean, Marx is like, there's classics and there's trends, right?
Yes. Well, I don't know if you want to do a takedown of *Sapiens* in a future. We can do like *Dawn of Everything* versus *Sapiens*. Who wins? Maybe you could do that. But then I'd have to read both.
Yeah, don't give yourself books that are too long to read.
This was a lot to read.
Yeah, this is a lot. Yeah.
I don't know how much I retained either, but it was interesting.
No.
It's a lot to retain.
Yeah.
But I think the things that I did learn about it was kind of, and it makes sense that he's an anarchist that wrote it. Just the idea of like how our assumptions are just really not based on, to say sometimes our most obvious assumptions are not sound, and that's, I think this whole journey of the podcast has made me realize more and more, like, it's obviously easier to see other people's biases and prejudices, much harder to see your own, because you don't think you think you're being rational, like you were saying, and you might just be brainwashed.
No, it's a good it's a good goal for most authors, I think, isn't it, to try and make you think about these things in different ways and like try and like reassess your own perspective on the world and your values and see that it's they're not always inevitable or not always the most sensible ones.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us in this very long conversation about debt. It was long and it covered so much, right?
Yeah, exactly. Just like the book, sort of touch on everything.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much for.
Thank
I owe you
having me.
one.
The Ignoramus's Guide to Surviving Humanity is available as a podcast on Spotify and Amazon Music.
You can also like and subscribe to our videos on YouTube. And if you want to help us grow, then you can become a patron on Patreon. And that's it, right? I think that's it.
Yeah.